Greetings, this is Greg. Flying and inventing the airplane are two different things. You could say that the General Lee flies, as the definition of flight isn't super solid. However, in no way and by no definition is a 1969 Dodge Charger an airplane. Yet I'm seeing quite a few people equate this sort of flight, which is really a jump or a powered leap, as evidence that so-and-so invented the airplane. I've noticed quite an uptick in nonsensical aviation videos on YouTube and in other places. Often they are well-produced, flashy videos, but full of misinformation. I can't always tell if it's because the content creators just don't know what they're talking about, or if it's more of an attempt to cash in. Normally, I don't fire back at this crap, but one particularly false narrative is getting out of hand, and that's the story of Gustav Whitehead, who a number of people are now claiming invented the airplane. I'm not sure Whitehead even flew as well as the General Lee, but he certainly did not invent the airplane. The Whitehead myth seems to come largely from what people claim to be an article in the American Inventor magazine from April of 1902. What most people seem to miss is that this isn't an article. It's a letter to the editor from Whitehead himself. In the letter, he makes some huge, and I mean huge, claims, not the least of which was that of a 7-mile flight the first day he flew it. He also claimed to have a 40-horsepower engine that weighed only 120 pounds complete, that was his description, and was apparently incredibly small and claimed to be very reliable. If that was true, it would have been an incredible engine and would have just taken the world by storm. For example, the well-regarded Anzani engine from 1909 had 24.5 horsepower and weighed 145 pounds. So Whitehead's claimed engine with 40 horsepower and only weighing 120 pounds would have been much more advanced than this later well-regarded Anzani engine. Even today, a 41 horsepower Rotax weighs more than the engine Whitehead claims to have designed and built. If Whitehead really had such an engine, that would have been almost as big a deal at the time as the invention of the aircraft itself. Indeed, it would have had a greater range of immediate applications. Even if he didn't want to sell it, his investors would have forced him to, and yes, he did have investors. As unbelievable as the engine story is, his entire aircraft saga is even more ridiculous. He claims that this airplane, this one, flew 7 miles in 1902 and had reached speeds of 70 miles per hour and was capable of 100 miles per hour. He even claimed it could reach 50 miles per hour on the ground. Then for some reason, he completely abandons the entire design and switches to something in 1903 that frankly looks more like a Wright design than anything Whitehead did before. Keep in mind, this is after the Wright designs were shown by Octave Chanute in France, and those drawings had really got around during that year. Of course, he couldn't get that to work well because he was missing a key design factor, several of them, as were the French, which I'll talk about. I don't think there's much question that Whitehead's 1903 glider, shown here, flew a little bit. It was towed along by a car with people on the ground using ropes to keep the wings level. However, it's not controllable by the occupant. Whitehead abandoned this design and went in yet another direction. Keep in mind, he was being paid for this work, so he had incentive to keep this going. However, he never delivered a flyable airplane to anyone. This is one of his later models built for Stanley Beach in 1908. It never flew under its own power, but could be towed aloft, much like the 1903 triplane glider he built. Children launch kites the same way. Sure, they fly, but nobody seriously thinks these are airplanes. Back to Whitehead. This page is from that letter to the editor he wrote and purports to show the flight path he took. Do you really think he flew 7 miles in 1902 with an airplane capable of making 360-degree turns and going 70 miles an hour with a claim top speed of 100 miles per hour, and then for some mysterious reason was never able to do it again? Or is it more likely that he wrote a tall tale to a magazine to spur investment? I hate to be mean, but if you believe Whitehead's story, you're either incredibly gullible or know nothing about aircraft history and performance. Someone is going to say, but witnesses! These witnesses fall apart when you examine the dates. There are about 17 people who claim to have seen Whitehead fly in 1901 or 1902. I have two things to say about this. First, witnesses are incredibly unreliable, and in this case, these are witnesses who made these claims more than 30 years after the event supposedly happened. That's a big problem, even if they are telling the truth. Do you think they can remember the exact year something happened decades earlier? Often I can't. I saw the Blue Angels fly F-4 Phantoms. I can't say if that was in 1971 or 1973. I saw Dreadnought and Sean D. Tucker at air shows in the early 90s. I can't say the exact year. I suspect they saw the triplane glider being towed in 1903 or 1904, if they saw anything at all, and then they're just off by a year or two. I also think that some of it was just a case of old people who were starved for attention and telling a female journalist who was writing about Whitehead exactly what she wanted to hear. Let's talk about the replica flights. Yes, it looks as if replicas of Whitehead's creation have sort of flown in the jumping or powered leap mode, but always with modern engines, propellers, and significant changes to the structure and design. They are really lookalikes, not replicas. We see the same thing with Dumont's lookalikes used to prop up that myth. I could go on shooting up the Whitehead myth and those of others pretenders to the throne, but rather than do that, I want to make a case for the Wrights that I haven't seen done before. I saw an interview with Elon Musk a while back, in which he described his method of interviewing a prospective employee. The gist of it was that he would ask them about a problem they solved on a project they worked on or claimed to work on, and then listen to them explain it. The idea here, which I think is sound, is that only a person who was actually there and solved the problem would be able to get the details right when put on the spot like that. When trying to invent the airplane in the early 1900s, there were a lot of problems to solve. We know what those problems were. Wing design and control were two of the biggest ones. We know how the Wrights solved these problems because the Library of Congress has a mountain of notes and letters from the Wright brothers. Of course, the majority of them were dated before being sent, so it's pretty easy to follow, and it's fascinating to read through them when armed with a modern understanding of aerodynamics. You can see when and how they encountered problems and how they solved them. One of the biggest problems was something called adverse yaw. Unless someone is pretty familiar with aircraft or with flying aircraft, it's not something one would know about. This was the last serious problem the Wright brothers had to solve before they had controlled flight. It was a problem they didn't see coming. Nobody did because the Wrights were the first to encounter it and the first to solve it. Adverse yaw is when the plane yaws opposite the direction of bank due to varying drag of the wings. For example, if you bank left for a left turn, the plane will normally try to yaw to the right because the portion of the wing or control surface being deflected downwards increases the angle of incidence, thus the angle of attack, resulting in more lift and decreased drag as compared with the wing that has the control surface that's deflected up. This is true for either wing warping or ailerons, both of which were covered by the Wright's patent, but that's another story. The extra drag from the surface that's deflected down yaws the airplane in the wrong or adverse direction. This is the explanation from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. The plane will also try to pitch down a little bit when in the bank, which is why in order to turn, it takes a coordinated motion of the ailerons, elevator, and rudder. In other words, you have to control roll, pitch, and yaw. Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators describes it about the same way. Any serious book on aerodynamics talks about adverse yaw. Everyone has seen this picture, but this isn't where the story started, and it's not where it ended. It's really the middle of the story, so let's go back to 1901. This is a 1901 Wright glider. It has pitch and roll control and was probably the most advanced glider ever built up to that point. However, it doesn't have nearly enough wing area and it has no method of controlling the yaw. As soon as the pilot would try to bank, the plane would yaw the wrong way, forcing a slip, and the plane would drop to the earth with a thud. The Wright brothers called this well digging because the thud sounded like a well pipe being pounded into the sand. By the way, this picture and most of those that follow were taken by Octave Chanute, another early aviation pioneer. I hear all the time from critics of the Wright that they had no witnesses. That's simply false. On the day of their famous 1903 flight, they had witnesses from the nearby lifeguard station, which was the forerunner of the U.S. Coast Guard. More important than that, they had people who witnessed all of the steps along the way, which is what we're talking about right now. Anyway, the flights on this day in 1901 were witnessed and photographed by Octave Chanute and his assistant. Of course, these were not really flights, at least I would not define them as flights, because this glider couldn't be controlled effectively. It was closer to the General Lee's mode than that of an actual glider. The Wrights then put a tail on the glider and increased the wingspan as they learned more about lift. But the well digging, as they called it, continued. They used both single and dual tails, but neither solved the issue. I don't think this one is a Chanute picture, but I'm not sure of its origins. On the night of October 3rd, 1902, Orville Wright realized that the vertical tail needed to be movable. The next morning, he talked it over with Loren Wright, one of his brothers that was visiting Kitty Hawk. Orville was talking to him in an attempt to get Loren on his side for what he expected to be a heated argument when talking about the idea with Wilbur. By the way, the Wright brothers' parents had 7 children. Wilbur and Orville were the 3rd and 6th of the 7. Loren was the 2nd child and the oldest son. Anyway, Wilbur bought into the idea without any real resistance. He recognized a good idea when he heard it, and they got to work on this right away. I mentioned the Wright diaries earlier. There is no lack of evidence for anything with the Wrights. In fact, it's the opposite. There's more evidence than you will likely be able to go through. Both Wilbur and Orville kept diaries, and they had many letters to their families and other aviation pioneers. All of this stuff can be found in the Library of Congress, which is where I got it. Here's a page from Orville Wright's diary from October 6, 1902. Let's turn the page and I'll read it to you. Quote, "We completed the change to the vertical tail, which we reduced to one surface of 6-foot area, which is now operated in conjunction with the wingtips, turning towards the wing with the smaller angle of incidence, so as to give it more resistance and thus allow the wing with the larger angle to rise more quickly." Unquote. In other words, they changed it to a movable single tail from the twin fixed tail setup. Furthermore, they made the now movable rudder operate in conjunction with the roll control, which was some real forward thinking on their part. Although the term adverse yaw didn't exist yet, it couldn't, as the problem had only been discovered 3 days earlier. The key points of the issue are described here. The text from Orville's diary shows that he understood that the wing with more lift when rolling would have more drag, and that drag had to be offset by the rudder. Now, Orville's diary doesn't mention yaw specifically, but it's a diary entry, not engineering notes, and they had only just figured this out. Still, it does cover the key points. Now let's look at their patent, which they filed on March 23rd in 1903. The language here is much more clear, either because they learned more by that point, or they were just being more careful with their wording, or both. This page of the patent describes the vertical tail or rudder using both of those terms. The following text describes the method of construction. It's on the next page, starting around line 11, that it gets really interesting. This text proves that the Wrights clearly understood adverse yaw and how to solve the problem. From the patent, quote, "The construction is such that the rudder will always be turned as to present its resisting surface on that side of the machine on which the lateral margins of the airplane present the least angle of resistance," unquote. Okay, so the rudder deflects in the direction towards the wing, which is presenting the least drag, aka resistance. That means if rolling left, the rudder goes left. That's exactly what's needed. We'll continue. This is going to be a bit long and wordy portion of legalese, so please bear with me. Quote, "The reason of this construction is that when the lateral margins of the aeroplanes are turned in the manner hereinbefore described as to present different angles of incidence to the atmosphere, that side presenting the largest angle of incidence, although being lifted or moved upward in the manner already described at the same time, meets with an increased resistance to its forward motion, and is therefore retarded in its forward motion, while at the same time the other side of the machine, presenting a smaller angle of incidence, meets with less resistance to its forward motion and tends to move forward more rapidly than the retarded side. This gives the machine a tendency to turn around its vertical axis, and this tendency, if not properly met, will not only change the direction of the front of the machine, but will ultimately permit one side thereof to drop into a position vertically below the other side, with the aeroplanes in a vertical position, thus causing the machine to fall. The movement of the rudder hereinbefore described prevents this action, since it exerts a retarding influence on that side of the machine which tends to move forward too rapidly, and keeps the machine with its front properly presented to the direction of flight and with its body properly balanced around its longitudinal axis." Unquote. This really couldn't be any more clear, especially when realizing that this was in 1903, way before the standardized terms to describe this phenomenon existed. They had to use terms like resistance to forward motion to describe what we now call drag, and movement around the vertical axis to talk about yaw, but it's an incredibly accurate description of adverse yaw even by today's standards. The Wrights clearly knew, as seen in their patent, that when changing the angle of incidence, that would increase drag on one side and reduce it on the other, and cause a yaw opposite the roll. They not only solved this with a rudder, they linked it into the roll control to make it easier for the pilot to manage, something that's done today in many larger aircraft, but wasn't often done on early airplanes. Without this correction for adverse yaw, the Wrights, or anyone else, would have continued well digging. In fact, Octave Chanute, who was a fellow early pioneer, went to France after taking all of those photos of the 1902 gliders. However, that was just before the Wrights figured out the adverse yaw issue, thus Chanute didn't know about it. He also failed to understand and convey the importance of the Wrights control systems. That's the reason that while the French and others built gliders like this one that looked a lot like the Wrights gliders, none of them flew well or were controllable. Solving the adverse yaw issue was the key. Immediately after they added in the rudder, they had a very successful and controllable glider in late 1902. The longest glides that year were just over 600 feet. This isn't well known, but in their patent they actually have a drawing of their glider, because that's what first used the successful version of their control system. At this point, they went to work on powered flight and spent most of 1903 working on it. The December 3rd flight was a big milestone, but only another step in the right direction. Detractors often point out that it wasn't a great flying airplane and argue over just how far the plane really flew. Often they falsely state that the plane used a catapult. None of that matters. The success on that day showed that all of the principles the Wrights had laid out were sound. On that day, the plane itself barely flew, which I think is what one would expect from a first flight, and it only barely flew due to a very advantageous density altitude on that particular day, something the Wrights didn't understand, at least initially. But it didn't really matter, because from there it was just a case of making incremental improvements to the basic design, which had been proven sound in principle on that fateful day. And by late 1904, they had what I would call an actual flying airplane. It could take off on a normal day, fly around for a while, make circles, come back and land. The discovery and solutions to adverse yaw were a huge part of that. So here is my challenge. I'll pay $1,000 to the first person to send me proof that someone understood and solved the issue of adverse yaw before the Wright brothers did it. It doesn't have to be Gustav Whitehead. It can be any aviation pioneer. In fact, it doesn't even have to be someone who claimed to actually fly. Obviously, I'm the one who decides what qualifies as proof and gets the $1,000, but the standards I'm setting here are pretty low. I'm not asking for a patent with a clearly worded legal description. I'm not asking for proof of a fully controllable airplane which actually flew. I'm only asking for a document that explains that a rudder is needed to offset what we now know as adverse yaw. That's it. Of course, it has to be a verifiably dated document and written before the Wrights discovered this. Lilienthal has a lot of writings on the subject of aerodynamics, so does Langley and the others. It's said that Whitehall did as well, but I can't find any. To all of you who keep posting in the comments about all of these pretenders to the throne, this is your chance to back it up and get paid for your trouble. I say you can't do it, and you can't do it because nobody had an airplane before the Wrights, thus nobody encountered this problem before the Wrights, let alone solved it. Of course, I'm always learning, and I welcome the chance to be proven wrong here. Frankly, that's well worth $1,000 to me. So let's see what happens. On the subject of the various YouTube and media documentary channels that keep promoting the idea that the Wrights did not invent the airplane, I'm willing to debate any of you, and I'm not hard to find. That's all for now. Goodbye, and have a great day.